another episode of SlatorPod 21. Today, special episode because Esther's computer has decided to go into partial lockdown. So for anybody watching this on YouTube, you're seeing a blank, dark space where Esther would be. But anyway, hi Esther.
Hello. Yes, I'm here on audio at least, hopefully.
Yeah, so, no change in experience for anybody listening in on the podcast, but for anybody watching it on YouTube, slightly different, but we are plowing on. Of course, very happy that this didn't happen yesterday when we had our very first inaugural webinar. We ran a webinar for anybody who bought our 2020 market report and for our research subscribers. Big success. I think we had like a 90% uptake rate. So there were a lot of people there. It was very good, and the system held up. We had to decide which way to go. Of course, there's like 7 different systems now, but we'd go to webinar. Maybe we're going to do a Zoom trial at some point. But we did have the localization manager of GoTo meeting at our Amsterdam conference. So we gave that system a shot. It worked well. What was your take on that yesterday, Esther?
Yeah, really good. More attendees than I was expecting, so that's a positive thing. But some really interesting insights as well from Barnaby and also Bruno. Enjoyable and definitely something I think we should and will do again.
Yeah, indeed. It's just it's always like you got to find a quiet place to run these things, and for me that's a bit of a challenge these days because they're building, as I probably mentioned in previous podcasts, here at home and at the office, and so I'm like literally I'm working out of like 5 different rooms at the moment, constantly evading the noise. Actually, before we started this podcast, I had to go upstairs and tell the builders to stop building for like 45 minutes so we could run this. You said it. So it was a short 1-hour webinar. We had we did a segment about the report, and then we had Barnaby Was from Transperfect, Senior Vice President. We have Bruno Bitter, CEO of MemoQ. Cool interview. Andrew interviewed Barnaby on what's going on in the industry, and then Bruno gave a presentation as well. Barnaby's very impressive, actually. I mean, he started, I didn't know, he was a translator. He originally started as a translator, or is a trained translator, and then started as a PM, a project manager for Transperfect, like probably 19 or 20 years ago. Now is a senior vice president at a $750 million company. So, that shows you also that there's quite a lot of career options for people in this industry. Rising from a translator to an SVP at such a large company is quite impressive. And he did confirm some of the takes we had on our verticals, media, production interruptions, and retail, of course, down, but also some other areas doing quite well still. So it was interesting to hear his assessment. We actually recorded the webinar and uploaded it for anybody who for the subscribers and the buyers of the report. They can access it with a password. So. That said, let's move to a slightly less positive note. We had to cancel SlatorCon London. I mean, that was kind of, I guess some people saw this coming, but it was in early, we rescheduled, of course, from May to September. And, I don't think right now it's feasible to plan anything in 2020. The situation is just so fluid. I mean, how are things in London? Because that's where we would have hosted that. I think last time you mentioned they gave an update on Sunday. So how are things now with the lockdown?
It's pretty much the same, I have to say. Technically we're allowed out of lockdown for I think as much exercise as we'd like. Plus, I think you're now allowed to actually sit down in a park and I think see one other person outside of your household. Not that this is a public service announcement or anything, and I might be wrong, but so you're allowed to see one other person outside your household, but still respecting the social distancing. So it's kind of inconceivable that we'd be able to be sort of 100, 120 people in a room, even if September's still sort of like 4 or 5 months away or whatever.
Yeah, and since SlatorCon is very, very international, right? I mean, there's probably 1/3 of the people would be from the London area, but then there's so many people flying in, and right now obviously,
well, you'd have to do like a 2-week quarantine to make it into SlatorCon.
Yeah, that would show commitment. That would show commitment to the cause. Yeah, that's a bit of a big ask. So anyway, canceled, but we'll be doing our very first remote conference, and we called it originally SlatorCon Remote. We had a bit of a back and forth, but there's all kinds of other options. But I think SlatorCon Remote for now is a great working title. And so we're going to do that on July 9th. We have a few speakers confirmed already. We're working out on the format, probably 3 to 4 hours. I'm not sure if anybody wants to stick around for an 8 or 9 hour online conference, but let's see how that goes. All right, today we're going to talk about just a few stories we had. So for basically 3 of these stories are related to people getting money. I mean, I know it's tough times, but 3 companies managed to raise money or are raising money. The first one is Plint, the Swedish media localizer. The second one is Lilt, and the third one we just read this morning is Keywords, that's also raising money. And then there was a super interesting feature around the Presbyterian church and how they went from like a single translator to a full-blown localization team. Marian wrote about that yesterday. So, talking about lockdowns and exceptions, Sweden has always been an exception in this entire pandemic, right? They didn't lock down. I mean, they didn't do a national lockdown, as far as I know. They still allowed events up to 50 people, and I think they didn't close restaurants, schools, or anything like that. And interestingly, they're now also an exception in terms of funding, deal flow, right? We do talk a lot about M&A in this industry, or at least have up until COVID came around. Yeah. And now, surprisingly, that Swedish private equity firm called Priveq decided to take a 55% stake in Plint, a media localizer. They were called Nordisk Undertext before, and now they rebranded into Plint. And I think it's remarkable that in a time where there's so much uncertainty right now, that you actually managed to close a deal, right? And that we spoke to both Plint CEO Örjan Cerner and the person from the private equity firm, Louise Nielsen. Yeah, Louise, and basically it seemed like the pandemic didn't really interrupt the process. I mean, also, of course, this is because the key client of Plint is Netflix. So, I mean, it's probably one of the major winners of this, and I'm sure that helped. But I think it's still remarkable that somebody would actually go through with a deal. So another kind of Swedish exception here. So the remaining, that Swedish firm, the private equity firm, took a bit more than half, 55% stake. The remaining shares are owned by the CEO Örjan Cerner, as well as Per Naukler and studio manager Johan Glad. So they have a fair amount of skin in the game left. And they said when they kicked off, they got a lot of interest from the process. That was pre-COVID. That must have been probably late last year. They said there was a lot of interest from both financial and strategic investors, but they wanted to stay independent, and so they brought on, or independent, like they want to continue to have the Plint brand, and so they felt the financial investor was the best choice. It's quite an active private equity firm. So they've been in the business for 35 years. They've invested a total of 128 companies, and have exited 110 to date, including like 27 IPOs. And typically they hold an investment for about 5 years. That's what Louise Nielsen said, their CEO. And so that's quite average. I mean, it's not very short, it's not very long. So, let's see how long they're going to be holding Plint for. But we looked at the revenues. So can you just remind us about their trajectory? I think they grew super quick over the past 5 years, right? Yeah,
I think 2015 was when they really kind of exploded, I suppose, or started to kick off, and that was when they also signed with Netflix. So have sort of followed that through. So 2015 they were around 11 million. This is Swedish crowns. This is the Swedish crowns. Yeah, and then so
let's just make sure we get the forex right here. So that's 11 million right now would be like 1.1 million US dollars. So basically a small agency. Right?
Yeah. So, I mean, in 2019, they were up to 21 million US dollars.
Wow.
So that's a significant growth over the 4 years in between. And they've kind of, so they doubled, I think, 2015 to 2016, doubled again 2016, 2017, and then almost tripled, I think. So yeah, really, really strong growth trajectory on the revenue, and also some progress on EBITDA as well.
Yeah. So that's, yeah, because they closed Netflix in 2015 when the whole, they really started with their major push. And I think they started as like a QA supplier. So they QA'd other LSPs' work and then moved into more of a core supplier role, like preferred suppliers, I think what Netflix calls them. Plint. So Plint does a lot of subtitling. I think mostly subtitling. I mean, Urian told us that they have, or Pierre told us that they've been dipping their toes, quote unquote, in dubbing. But mostly it's been subtitling, and now they're looking at expanding into dubbing, probably with some of those funds. And also Louise, the private equity CEO. When we asked, well, what's the plan for the funds? She said likely it's mostly for organic growth. Which is very interesting because it's different from this typical financing model in the industry where you buy a so-called platform company and then you bolt on like additional companies with through acquisitions. So this is nice for a change. Seems that those investors have kind of a bit of a vision on the product and the service and the company, kind of building it up organically. And obviously media is probably a good space to try to do that. So yeah, so that's Plint. He also told me, I mean, I keep asking these people, like, how much did he pay for the domain name? Plint.com is a fantastic domain. Hang on, is it, well, it's a 5-letter .com domain, which is super easy to remember. And it's only $1,000, so that's a steal. That domain is,
they got it. I think they actually they bought the domain several years before they actually rebranded to Plint, I believe.
Yeah. Still though, I mean, Slator was also $1,000.
Yeah.
At the time.
So
that was a steal too. It's a 6-letter. Yeah. And it's not a real word like Plint. But still, it's great to have these domains, right? People can remember it. So next up is Lilt, which I loved Lilt's technology at the time. I was able to use it. Again, also I'm a former translator, so I played around with Lilt when they launched, like in 2016. I think I first used the product 2017. So they went through a few iterations. They started out as like a pure SaaS, translation productivity cat tool based on a SaaS model, like you sell individual subscriptions, pivoted to selling the tech to LSPs, but then eventually now they're like a tech-enabled LSP, and so I can't really test the product anymore. Probably should get in touch and see, because the product it was very novel at the time it came out, and I don't think anybody has kind of really replicated it today, like the exact way, because it's the interactive part. So you're, as a translator, you're typing, and the MT basically adjusts or adapts as you're typing. And that's, I think it's, in my humble opinion, that's the way you should actually interact with translation. But again, that's coming from somebody who's not translating anymore. But I like the product. So they announced 2 days ago that they raised Series B, $25 million. But that said, that they raised that before the pandemic hit. So they, for some reason, held off on the announcement. I mean, they told us it was because of the pandemic. But, they still now decided they decided to hold off the announcement of the raise because of the pandemic. But, I still don't really understand why you would hold off on that. Now they announced, and it's a pretty big round. It's not the 60 million unbubble round, but it's 25 million. That carries you quite some way. And, we did a quick email interview with CEO Spence Green. Spence used to work for Google Translate 9 or 10 years ago, and then started the company in 2015. And so, now he's the CEO. And they raised from some really big names. Like this time, the lead fund was Intel Capital, I think. But they also had some other big names. Sequoia Capital, that was the lead in Series A, again, invested in this round. And then Red Point Ventures, which we had, Tom Tungush was at our SlatorCon San Francisco conference. So successful raise, and of course just in time for the pandemic. Because if you've gone into this pandemic with kind of a low cash, and you were hoping to raise in maybe the first half of 2020, you might be in trouble. And we spoke about that before. So at least Lilt's going into this with with a solid cash balance. Let me put it this way. Mm-hmm. So they also, in their pivot, they to more of a service provider, of course, with strong underlying tech. They hired Paula Shannon, who was the former chief sales officer of Lionbridge and probably one of the best connected names in the industry. And I think this was an incredibly smart move because it also understands that shows that Lilt really understands the enterprise sales cycle in this industry, which technology can get you so far. But yet, at the end of the day, if you want to scale into the bigger enterprises, you really need to also have a sales force on the ground. You need to have offices and client people on the ground, and that's what Spence said as well, that they're investing some of that into actually setting up on site, in country, and really expanding kind of the footprint. So it's a more traditional model. TransPerfect, for example, is probably like 60 office locations now. Actually, that's what Barnaby told us yesterday. They just opened in Turkey, right? So they understand if you want to do business in a country, you need to have a presence there. So it looks like Lilt's following in that. And Paula's enterprise background, enterprise experience, sales experience is going to be super helpful there. And just finally, briefly about Lilt. We also asked Spence around his kind of top 3 machine translation trends, because he's a computer scientist, used to work for Google Translate, and now has built this MT-based company. And he said first is what he called the exceptional improvement in personalized MT models. So you basically, as a translator, you're using a system, and then it's adjusting to you, it's adapting to you. The second one, he said, the ability to add more contextual information in translation suggestions. And we've covered this quite a lot last year with some research where, the systems are taking document level information to improve the MT, because otherwise it just goes sentence to sentence, and you kind of have to, the system is really dumb in terms of not understanding what the context of the document is about. And then the third one is a bit more arcane. It's like more efficient automatic tag placement. So what it really shows, though, is that Spence is really taking this from the practitioner view, right? An actual implementation view. So those are all very practical improvements to the day-to-day work of a translator, as opposed to the more blue sky research that we're sometimes seeing on these preprint servers that we cover from time to time. All right, so that's that. That's Lilt, that's Plint. Lilt is four-letter domain, lilt.com. Plint is 5-letter domain. So, okay, both of these companies have great domains. Let's move on to a totally different topic, or totally different, category. It would be the Presbyterian Church.
Yeah.
What was that story about?
Presbyterian Church. This is the feature that Marion wrote and published yesterday. So an interview with their global language resources manager, Jason Raff, who told us a bit about their localization operations. So just for context, this is the Presbyterian Church in the USA. They have 1.7 million members, 10,000 congregations in the US. So pretty big, and obviously multi sort of lingual congregations as well. They set up an Office of Language Resources in 2018. So the idea here was really to improve language access for the congregations. And they have really the main demand is for Spanish and for Korean. So they have a big focus on these 2 languages. And they currently have 5 people in the localization team, including Jason, plus 2 Spanish translators and 2 Korean translators. But they want to ramp up as well and add potentially a project coordinator in 2021 in Kentucky, I think they're based. So in terms of the volumes, pretty sizable. I mean, they told us that they did 1.5 million words in Q1 2020 alone. Okay. So that's sort of, somewhere around 6 million, I guess, annually. And they've got a range of content. They have their own actual news service, sort of a newsletter that's distributed to members. Plus, they have sort of things relating to the actual workings of the church, constitutional stuff, some legal stuff, and finance content also. So interesting kind of content, and a lot of that is performed internally because they do have such specific terminology requirements, particularly, and it does help to have knowledge of the church. But they are also using a pool of freelancers, they've said, and they would not be opposed to using LSPs for some of the other language combinations. They do also have occasional demand for East Asian, Southeast Asian, African languages, and Arabic, they told us. So in terms of the actual setup, I mean, this is kind of, I guess, starting to become a bit more centralized as they've gone from, like you said, Florian, having one Spanish translator to now sort of, well, way more than that. And then they're sort of centralizing and maturing as well in their localization approach. So they've adopted SmartLing as their TMS, and they're pursuing sort of other more developed localization strategies as well. They're not currently using machine translation, but they said they are exploring post-editing of machine translation for the news service. And one thing I think was pretty interesting was that Jason told us that he was inspired by the approach of ASICS, which, if you remember, we had yes. their localization director, Alessandra Benazzi, do a feature on Slator as well about their localization at ASICS. And Jason said that the Presbyterian Church is looking at doing a similar approach with centralized tools, with the idea being to empower kind of local stakeholders as well to take some ownership of the processes as well. And then one other thing that I'll just share was around simultaneous interpreting, very relevant in the current climate. So they are and were scheduled to have a massive conference in June of 2020, and that's been moved online now for obvious reasons. So the plan now is to conduct the conference online using Zoom and using the new interpreting feature in Zoom to provide interpreting services.
Really? Zoom has an interpreting feature?
Yeah. So I just read that in the article that apparently Zoom has a new interpreting feature. So I don't know too much about it myself, but I think we'll have to do some digging around that.
Let's do some digging. Yeah.
Yes.
I must have missed this when I read the article, but that's interesting because I mean, Zoom is what everybody's talking about right now, and if they have an interpreting feature, we should really look at it and how it works.
Yes.
So that's that for the Presbyterian Church.
It was a short break from the financial raises.
Yes. So yeah, it's crazy. It's a crisis, and these people are getting money while everybody else is trying to hold on to their cash, right? So that's interesting. Yeah, and I like that. This it's kind of an interesting point in time. We've got in touch with Jason, right? I mean, he's very new, as you mentioned, and I mean, going from a single Spanish translator to now, I think they have about 5 FTEs in the localization team. It's quite unusual, for this particular time now in 2020, but also just generally, like that it's an interesting early point in kind of the localization maturity curve, and then also I really appreciated the openness, like with, that they're telling us the volume, they're telling us that they looked at a couple of TMSs and decided to go with SmartLing. And I mean, this is, it's very interesting and very, it's very generous that they're sharing this type of information on the record, right?
For sure.
With a news channel. So I appreciate that. All right, so for anybody who's not interested in finance, you might want to drop off now. No, I'm just kidding. So let's move over to just briefly keywords. Again, listed. How much did it do in localization? 25-30% of the revenue, or?
Yeah, around 30, 33. About a third we worked out when you actually include the audio services, which is where the dubbing is housed. Yes. So somewhere between 25 and 30. One third, yeah. Yeah,
big company, 1/3 in lock. And today they announced they're going to place 100 million pounds. So that's like roughly 120 million US in shares. So they listed on the stock market, and they're raising via a share placement. And usually that drives down, of course, your share price because, well, there's going to be more shares around. Looks like this didn't really happen that much. I mean, I checked this morning, it was only down like 4%. But why would Keywords do that? Well, it's for buying more companies. They must have acquired about 40 plus companies since they went IPO, 6 or whatever years ago. And now in their prospectus, they're citing that they see they're expecting, quote unquote, to see some stress in predominantly small service provider, which are typically single location service with fewer clients and less able to weather the disruption. They quote a survey of 300 professionals from game developers, game publishers, and service providers conducted in late March, where 29% said they fear a risk of insolvency if Corona was going to continue for more than 6 months. And so they're saying that this is likely to result in an increased number of acquisition opportunities for Keyword Studios, with some targets now more inclined to re-engage previously stale exploratory conversations. Well, that's a smart move. I mean, get the cash and then try to do acquisitions at a better price. And it's, I guess, a more standard approach than the one we discussed last time with the big words email that I've now found out literally everybody in this industry has gotten. And I have yet to find somebody who thought it was a smart idea. So, so the keyword approach in terms is it was more normal. You raise the cash and then you do one-on-one conversations with people that you think would be interesting to bring on board. All right, so that was it for today's Slater Pod. Stay tuned for what's going to be a lot of good stories also again next week, and stay safe wherever you are. Thanks a lot for this, Esther.
Thank you. See you next week.
All right, take care. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.